Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we're going to be talking about the circumstances surrounding World War II. It's a little bit of its effects, what led up to it, and how it's viewed in the minds of people. And as I'm from the United States, I want to point out that the United States sees World War II as America rescuing the world from tyranny. And I think Pat Buchanan's book, The Unnecessary War, um, well, it's Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, basically dismantles to some degree that concept. And with me to discuss this topic is Apostolic Majesty, the wonderful internet historian, and probably the best history channel, the best history channel on the internet. AM, welcome back to the show.
Well, that's a very kind epithet you've given me, Connor. But it's always wonderful to come on and talk to you and talk about the subject. So ready to get into it.
Awesome. Now, it really is kind of impossible to talk about World War II without discussing the aftermath of World War One. With the Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Trianon, even you could to some degree was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, even though that was later obviously sort of nullified by virtue of German loss, though to some degree it still took some effect because of the wars post World War One. But basically, Germany is partially dismantled. Austria-Hungary is utterly dismantled in favor of what it was called by Woodrow Wilson self-determination. But that self-determination created a lot of blurry lines around groups of people. In like Czechoslovakia is a perfect example of a country that is basically a hodgepodge of different ethnicities who more or less were dominated by the Czechs. Now, AM, do you see as Pat Buchanan sees that Versailles was sort of a Carthaginian peace?
Uh, Sorry, do you mind if I go back a bit and maybe
Sure.
explain who Pat Buchanan is and perhaps the significance of this book?
Yes.
Because obviously, I think people who may be very familiar with yours or my content may already know who Pat Buchanan is. For people who aren't aware, he's not a historian, but he was a very prominent American politician. He served as an advisor to Nixon and an advisor to Reagan, and I believe he stood in the Republican primaries in 1992 and 1996, but not as your typical neocon sort of Republican, rah-rah, military-industrial complex candidate. No, he has been typified as paleo-conservative, whatever that means. In reality, I think he is very significant as an American thinker and sort of a political pundit now, because he represents skepticism regarding the current foreign policy of the United States and the historic foreign policy of the United States. He is a rare advocate for realpolitik, and he laments the fact that the United States transitioned essentially from a process of isolationism and focusing on the Americas to becoming a global empire as a result of this war, the Second World War. And it's interesting the fact that an American would become fixated on Britain's unnecessary war, because the unnecessary war is essentially a tale of the failure and folly of British foreign policy throughout the late 19th and 20th century. But if anything, that's a credit to him, because of course the United States is seen as one of the great beneficiaries of the Second World War, and yet he's able to take an objective enough stance to actually detach himself from the quote unquote sort of gains of America during World War II, to put this in a much broader perspective involving the United Kingdom. And that being some introduction to Pat Buchanan, of course, there is so much more you can read into him, especially his critiques of managerialism, but just in terms of realpolitik, be relevant to this discussion. As for the book, This book is relatively recent. Well, relatively recent. It came out about 15 years ago. I remember reading it at university. I read part of it for a series I did about 3 years ago, and I had the joy of rereading it for this discussion. And you bring up this question of sort of Versailles, but I think the reason Pat Buchanan and reading The Unnecessary War is a kind of must for anyone who's interested in realpolitik is that it takes all the conventional wisdom, what academic agent will refer to as boomer truth, and flips it on its head. And you can say one of the brilliance of Pat Buchanan not being an academic historian in terms of his approach here, is that he leans very heavily on the established secondary source materials which we have available to us, such as the work of Evans, the work of Kershaw, Shirer, A.G.P. Taylor, and then going back to the First World War, people like Neil Ferguson, Andrew Roberts. And so he is able to engage with the secondary literature, and then he's essentially able to turn it on its head and expose, you can say, the contradictions inherent in that thinking and the implicit assumptions that many of these historians make, or you can say the ground that they're not prepared to cover. In fact, I would say actually the weakest parts of the book is when he relies too much on historians as opposed to engaging properly in terms of the critiques and the arguments given. But in addition to the material provided by the academic consensus, he goes in and provides a divvy of uh, personal reflections and primary sources as well. So it's a very engaging and well researched book, and like I say, a must as a introduction into this topic if you want to reappraise the foreign policy of Britain, and indeed you can say the wider West in the 20th century.
A bit also on Pat Buchanan from an American perspective also is that he is kind of the person that everyone should have listened to when it was opportune to listen to, but they ignored him because it was unpopular to follow his ideas.
Well,
Not to
I
mention,
mean, it's not necessarily unpopular to follow his ideas, more that the Republican Party found him very unpopular, kind
well,
of like a certain figure who has, you can say, created a hostage situation with the Republican Party today. It would be very interesting if he had won, I think, the 1996 uh, candidacy and election, because if you had an isolationist and a advocate of realpolitik around the same time as 9/11 and things like that, the whole history of the world may have changed radically. But yes, interesting in terms of a much maligned figure who could have fundamentally changed the trajectory of the United States.
I guess popular maybe not the right word, but I guess when I think of popular, I'm thinking popular amongst the elites. His ideas weren't popular amongst the elites, and it reminds me a little bit of either Enoch Powell or Peter Hitchens over in Britain regarding the collapse of Britain, the sort of collapse of America as Americans, I guess, would like it to be or would hope it to be, is rolled basically summed up by Pat Buchanan's warnings that that people didn't follow, especially from a foreign policy perspective. Um, anyways, so you have, I mean, let's go a little further back. Can you just give us an explanation of splendid isolationism? Because there's, in some sense, America has an isolationism, and Britain had an isolationism uh, before World War One. So, could you talk about that a little bit?
Certainly, Pat Buchanan draws attention to the fact that prior to the First World War, the United States had essentially a mantra of no foreign entanglements, no permanent alliances with European powers. In a similar fashion, up until the first decade, or really you can say 1914, the United Kingdom and by extension the British Empire adopted a similar policy of no hard alignments with various European factions. And such a policy gave both the United States and Britain essentially free rein, and also didn't entail them to get involved in any conflicts which weren't directly in their own interest. And you can say very broadly that this policy would essentially define realpolitik, and then all of a sudden becoming entangled in the affairs of other nations, putting this very simply and broadly, can become the antithesis of realpolitik, the antithesis of splendid isolationism as represented by the United States and Britain. So Pat Buchanan is as much a critique of this foreign policy as it is a narrative around this transition.
Now, with splendid isolationism, it's sort of coming when Britain came out of splendid isolationism, basically for World War One at the urging of Sir Edward Grey. It seems to me that most people would find it incomprehensible that Britain went to war, a world war specifically for Belgium. And I always thought Belgium was well, I always thought World War II seemed more reasonable growing up of why everybody got involved. But now, after reading the book, it seems more incomprehensible. Poland seems like a much more unlikely thing to defend for Great Britain than Belgium does.
Do you want me to take us to Belgium, as opposed to why Belgium would be seen as a casus belli,
Well, no,
for
if you
getting
could
us
just
involved?
talk about how do you see Belgium as equal ridiculous as Poland, or do you see Belgium as a more realistic reason for going to war?
Okay, well, that question I think would remove us from the historical context. But in terms of just pure strategy, irrespective of what sort of got us into that conflict. Okay, assuming we're fighting to protect Poland or we're fighting to protect Belgium. Okay, well, in the abstract, what does Belgium offer us? Belgium offers essentially a buffer, not just against Germany, but against both France and the Netherlands, which is why we were so gun ho about formalizing the creation of Belgium in the 1830s. Of course, Belgium also has a sea access, it has sea access into the North Sea, and can threaten the Channel. And indeed, the position of Belgium has been historically a threat to the British Empire. It was controlled by the Spanish Empire, then it was controlled by the French Empire, and then it was controlled by the Dutch. And invariably, at all points, sort of in the last sort of 500 years, we had been at war with those various nations. And so there was a naval strategy, most of all pioneered by Churchill, which believed that if Britain was to be secure in its maritime power, Germany could not have a entrepot onto the North Sea, because up until that point they were based around Kiel and Wilhelmshaven. So yes, you can say in the abstract, irrespective of every point that got us to here, the strategic significance was such that, as Pat Buchanan actually outlines in the book, had Germany not invaded, Churchill was more than willing to actually preempt an invasion of Belgium to secure those ports and prevent Belgium forming an alliance with Germany. So, yeah, regardless of any sort of moral quibble you're going to, I'm talking completely removed from any moral factors, because
Mhm.
frankly, they all seem to recede into the background when it comes to real politics, and the claims to sort of greater morality don't tend to hold much water with me. So that is, you can say, a clear objective as to why Belgium matters to us and why we are somewhat invested in Belgium. As for Poland, no, there is virtually no interest in Poland at all, apart from, you can say, a much grander sort of a strategy arc of just trying to bleed the Russians or bleed the Germans dry. But in terms of the actual, i.e., in terms of felling each other over Poland, but in terms of the actual geography of Poland and its relevance to the British Empire, Poland is nearly landlocked. And of all, you can say, the naval spheres that we operated out of as the British Empire, the Baltic Sea is really kind of an irrelevance. It's more of a German, Swedish versus sort of Russia conflict zone. So just from that point alone, just from the point of view of realpolitik, I think you can understand why Belgium seems more sort of relevant to the interests of the British Empire rather than Poland. But like I said, this is essentially a hypothetical discussion, as if this were, true of all times. And I believe if this were true of all times, then you can understand that in a vacuum, World War One would seem to be more justified if we simply boil it down to a case of Belgium.
Indeed, I wanted to mention or wanted to discuss that only because it seems important to basically get into sort of people's impression of World War II and World War One, and that you brought up Churchill, which was great. The fact that he had prepared to preemptively, or wanted to prepare to preemptively invade Belgium, which would break the neutrality of Belgium himself, even if the Germans were unwilling to do that themselves. That shows how it seems like Churchill is basically a warmonger, at least in World War One, as a liberal naval minister. It Do you see a lot of contradictions in Churchill? To me, he just seems like the most contradictory figure.
That's a very loaded question. I'll try and give you the best explanation, and I'm sure we'll refer back to this throughout the course of this discussion because he is everywhere, he pops up everywhere. But there was one part from the book I actually wanted to reference, which was a quote Buchanan has taken from A.G. Gardner in his Pillars of Society, which, interestingly enough, was actually written in 1913, so before World War One and before World War Two, but nevertheless, it's very perspicacious, should become obvious. He sees himself moving through the smoke of battle, triumphant, terrible, his brow clothed with thunder, his legions looking to him for victory and looking in vain, and not looking in vain. He thinks of Napoleon, he thinks of his great ancestor, that being the Duke of Marlborough. Thus did they bear themselves, thus in this rugged and most awful crisis will he bear himself. It is not make-believe, it is not insincerity, it is that in the fervid and picturesque imagination there are always great deeds afoot, with himself cast by destiny in the Agamemnon role. He will write his name big in the future. Let us take care he does not write it in blood. And obviously, if we're to look at Churchill as essentially a megalomaniac, a figure who was always sort of, marching to the sound of the guns and trying to make a big event of it, you can say that in the most sort of fanciful and abstract terms, that is essentially all Churchill's career is. It is sound and fury, but worse than signifying nothing, it signified the ruin of all of his purported goals, the most stringent of which was, of course, the defense of the British Empire. And thereby, I think it's fair to say that Churchill did not have a conscious strategy of what he wanted to achieve outside of himself. I very much see Churchill as an actor only considerate for his own political career and his own legacy. And you can almost see this, Pat Buchanan references explicitly when he talks about the fact that Churchill ratted out from the Liberal Party in 1904, the Conservative Party in 1904, at a very opportune time when the Conservatives were split over the issue of tariff reform, meaning that he came into the Liberal government with the largest majority I think they ever had in the 20th century, certainly. And so he was quickly elevated throughout their ranks and became one of the most radical members. And people hated him for this. I mean, his father, Randolph Churchill, was always seen as a bit of a maverick, but Churchill was basically seen as a traitor, a class traitor for everything that he was doing in terms of becoming from, one of the greatest aristocratic seats, Blenheim Palace, going off to become a social radical. But of course, he was a social radical and he was effectively the political equivalent of a blunderbuss. He was very much quote unquote jingoistic. And by jingoistic, I mean going out to find foreign quarrels wherever they may come about. And I believe that there was an undercurrent in Churchill's sort of thinking, which is again rather myopic. And someone is saying, yes, in the sense he was also a race traitor. It was a slip of the tongue, but a bit of a Freudian slip, and that a bit of truth came out of there as well. But I do believe there is a recurrent Germanophobia which obsesses his entire thought. And this, you can say, overclouds so much and makes some of his later actions seem inexplicable. For Pat Buchanan, one of the most inexplicable turns for Churchill is how he was one of the most rabid anti-communists in 1918, 1919, with the advent of the Soviet Union and the October Revolution, to the point that he was the greatest cheerleader for the Siberian interventions. Yet, when we come to Hitler in 1933, and most sort of assuredly, actually, when it comes to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, this isn't actually something Pat Buchanan goes into, but it's something Sean McMeekin goes into in Stalin's War, which is the idea that Stalin actually favored the expansion of the Soviet Union into the Baltic states, into Poland, again, the expansion of communism, because it would check German expansion. And he was, again, desperate. His one goal seemed to be, regarding the Soviet Union, was to get the Soviet Union to fight Germany. He understood strategically that the Soviet Union was the only land power capable of defeating Germany. Yet, in terms of forming an alliance with the Soviet Union, that would seem to be antithetical to all of his goals regarding anti-communism, but also the preservation of the British Empire, because the Soviet Union was completely opposed to the British Empire at every sort of ideological level. So yes, you can say that that is an absolute contradiction there. But I would say, in terms of trying to explain it, what was a factor in 1939 that wasn't a factor in 1919?
The element also, Churchill isn't actually in power in 1939 when.
Yes, I know, but these are simply his own strategic
Sure.
calculations. But from his own perspective, what is a factor in 1939 that isn't a factor in 1919?
uh,
German power. In
but isn't.
1919,
Oh,
Germany is
sorry,
defeated.
1919. I was thinking of 1914, sorry.
No, in
Um,
1919, Germany is defeated. So it
yes,
seems that anti-communism is a luxury position for Churchill, which is only permitted by the absence of Germany as some greater threat. So if there is a consistent through line throughout all of Churchill's considerations, going all the way back, I think, to 1905, when we have the first Moroccan crisis and the formalization of the Entente Cordiale between France and Britain, people have always also suggested that he was under the influence of shadowy figures, but in particular, we're talking about Zionism. But I don't believe that's a very convincing argument, because the Germans in the First World War were not the Germans in the Second World War. So you can say a rampant Germanophobia is a far more sort of apt expression as to why Churchill fixated so exclusively on Germany. But as we can clearly see, in terms of the whole trajectory of the empire, that was an incredibly myopic and inexplicable position to take within the grand course of British history, especially given the fact that we had not been historic enemies. We had historically been allies with Prussia. Of course, Prussia and Britain were allies during the Battle of Waterloo, and it was the intervention of Blucher which saved Wellington's army there. But so not only was this a rampant Germanophobia, but it was a rampant Germanophobia which was historically incongruous. There was no sort of through line of continuity. It was quite a radical position to take up. And if I'm trying to come up with some sort of origin point, you can say it stems maybe from some sort of vitriol attached to the creation of the High Seas Fleet by Germany. This idea that this impudent Kaiser was going to threaten British preeminence at the sea, which again, if that's to be taken clearly, that again would represent a total contradiction given his policy towards the Navy in the 1920s. So yes,
that's true, yeah.
You're correct in the sense that Churchill does have one through line, which is anti-Germany, but in all of his other positions, whether it be the Navy, whether it be foreign policy, the Empire, the Soviet Union, he not only flips on his position, but he flips absolutely, definitively, to the point that, again, other than just defeating Germany, you can't see that Churchill really stood for anything.
The only thing I could ever think of as a reason to break, or outside of the things you just said, breaking that alliance that did exist between Britain historically and Prussia or Germany, uh, does Does Hanover have anything to do with this? Is Hanover influenced the policy at all, especially after like 1866?
Well, this is a very interesting question. Why did Britain go to war with Germany in 1914 but didn't go to war with Germany in 1870? Because we'd had, if we, again, this is why I hate the standard view of the build up towards World War One, because it's always done through a series of provocations towards Britain. You know, the Moroccan crisis, the Bosnian crisis, the ultimatum over Belgium, etc. And of course, these people don't consider the fact that Denmark was friendly to Britain in the 1860s, and there had been the Second Schleswig-Holstein War between Prussia and Denmark. In 1866, as you mentioned, Prussia had annexed Hanover, which only 30 years earlier had been in personal union with the United Kingdom, as obviously the Hanoverian dynasty. And then 4 years after that, Prussia invaded France, which again created all the similar sort of geostrategic implications that were informing us in terms of our position to go along with Paul Cambon and essentially fight for the preservation of France in 1914. So yes, it is possible to basically turn a blind eye to Germany, as we did under Bismarck, but we did not turn a blind eye towards the Kaiser. But in terms of a comparison, it is quite fascinating to consider.
Did anybody ever, like in those times, bring up Hanover as like a justification for animosity?
Well, again, you can say this is a bit of a conspiracy theory, but uh, what's his name? Augustus, who was the uncle of Queen Victoria. Had Britain had only sort of male succession, he would have become king instead of Queen Victoria. And indeed, had Queen Victoria sort of not survived, then Augustus would have become king of both Hanover and the United Kingdom. However, because of German Salic law, the throne split. Queen Victoria did not inherit Hanover, and he became the King of Hanover. But unlike Queen Victoria, he was not content essentially to rule over a liberal constitution, which is why various figures in Britain wanted to get rid of him and were so happy essentially when the division happened, when Queen Victoria ascended, and then he went over to Hanover. So you can say that there was a ideological breach between Hanover and Britain, Hanover pursuing a more absolutist course and Britain becoming increasingly liberal. And also, you can say historically, Hanover hasn't been an asset to us, but Hanover was a liability. You know, why did we originally form an alliance with Prussia in, what was it, 1756, if my memory serves? Because the King of England, then George II, wanted the Prussians to protect Hanover, and that got us embroiled in one of the greatest wars in the 18th century that, had we lost, could have resulted in the ruin of the colonies. And it's only happenstance that we happened to win that war so decisively. But the point is, and again, during the Napoleonic conflict, Hanover was, of course, occupied, and George III essentially had to accept the fact that Hanover, if not sort of remaining in the possession of France, may have even gone over to Prussia. So yes, I think historically it's proven to be a bit of a liability. So maybe there was a bit of dynastic animosity, but the same dynastic animosity existed over Denmark as well, because the Danish royal house went along and basically married into all of the royal houses of Europe at that time, including the British royal house. So if there is a dynastic animosity, it comes out of Denmark and Hanover. But like I said, there was little in the way of a strategic impetus to hold on to Hanover, so to speak. We'd essentially renounced it. And in terms of the actual sort of legacy, there is a, if I recall, I could be wrong because I'm going off memory here. There is a tiny island off the northwest of Hanover called Helgoland, and that was essentially a British possession that was handed over to Germany, I think, in the year 1890. But that, of course, was basically, you can say, a forward position for the British Navy to basically keep checks on Prussia, Germany. And of course, after we surrendered that island, Germany decides to become a naval power. So maybe that was in many ways more significant than the loss of Hanover. But this is a bit of a tangent, but hopefully I've answered your question.
That it just amplifies the needlessness of Britain's involvement in the continent. You know, there's a lot of discussions of the fact that in the book, of the fact that Britain would would try and balance things out on the continent in order to make sure nobody was the dominant uh, leader in on the continent. And it seems to me that also part of that was because at the time, as you stated, they had Hanover, they had a greater interest in continental affairs, while the Britain of World War One and World War Two have no possessions on the continent to be that are threatened. Um, and post World War One, we have Italy, Britain, and France as allies because Italy chose the side of the Entente instead of the Central Powers. And Pat Buchanan points out that the alienation um, of Italy, of Mussolini, led to led to him going straight into Hitler's arms, even though Mussolini seemed to be one of the biggest critics of Hitler in the 30s, or at least the early 30s. Do you think that's an accurate like interpretation? Do you think that that was there was a way to keep uh, Mussolini out of Hitler's camp?
I think just for the sake of the audience, I'm worried that we may be jumping around a bit too much in terms of the chronology. But I'll try and answer your question. But it'll be very long, and I'll try and bring some other factors into it as well.
Well, before you go, we're gonna go straight, hopefully, chronologically from now on.
Okay. Um, there's one point, and this, of course, actually pertains to events before Belgium and the First World War. Um, in terms of trying to chart a trajectory of British foreign policy, um, we come to the era of splendid isolation. Another aspect you can say is actually appeasement to other powers, not just Germany, but historic appeasement towards America. So one point that Pat Buchanan actually brings up, which is not really mentioned at all, is the fact that Britain actually showed a very deferential policy towards the United States from 1898 onwards, when we decided to basically turn a blind eye to the acquisition of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, which basically created the American empire in the Caribbean and in the Pacific Ocean. And to add to that, we turned a blind eye when the Americans decided to create the Panama Canal. Why is this relevant? Well, it comes up to part of the reason as to why Britain was willing to jettison potential allies along the road, essentially to going to war with Germany in 1939. It may be an interesting alternative historical scenario had Britain decided to ally with Spain in 1898 and thus prevented the American intervention in Cuba and prevented the Americans creating the Panama Canal.
Was that at
Because
all likely?
well, think about it this way. From the perspective of the British, we control Canada. We also control some islands in the Caribbean. We also have a preeminent position in China, which is finally being threatened by Japan. We also have control over some islands in the Pacific. We also have control over Australia. If the Americans take over the Spanish possessions, it basically signals that all European possessions in the Americas are fair game. But moreover, it means the Americans are now a factor across several strategic theaters, of which basically they weren't a factor before. Going back to the whole Germany question, the reason why everyone focuses so much on bloody Germany is the idea that the Hun was building his empire and complicating the whole arena of international relations. Well, wasn't America doing the same thing before Germany? That is, I believe, always a valid question to bring up, and I have to basically predicate this on a racial bias again and a juxtaposing the Germanophobia of British politicians versus a philo-Americanism embraced by figures such as Winston Churchill, Balfour, Philip Kerr. I can name many others, but it's in fact something that my co-host on History of Today, Semyagog, mentioned regarding a very long history of, I wouldn't say American-British cooperation, but deference. And if you're going to see deference, it very much arrives in 1898, where you can say there was a deliberate attack against the interests of the British Empire. And again, you mentioned earlier the idea that Britain supports the balance of power. Britain supports this idea of propping up the small nations against America. Well, Spain was very much the small nation vis-a-vis the Americans. And of course, there was another consideration, which would be supporting Spain was in no way a threat to us. And supporting Spain, a smaller naval power, would have been very useful to check the expansion of the American Navy, which of course gained parity with us during the interwar years. So yes, I do believe it's a very interesting point that he brings up. And I think these aren't counterfactuals that he posits, but nevertheless, I'm engaged in counterfactuals because I believe part of understanding history is as much understanding what has happened as opposed to what could happen. Otherwise, you tend to have a very blinkered and unimaginative view of events, understanding that people looking at events saw a huge raft of possibilities ahead of them, as opposed to one definitive view, and that view had to essentially be the course of history. So that's one consideration to make, i.e., Britain has jettisoned a potential ally. In this case, that would be Spain vis-a-vis the United States. Then we come on to Japan. I have always made the contention that Britain's alliance with Japan was one of the greatest sort of diplomatic coups in all of British history. And the reason I make that is because rather than build up a naval power presence in the East, Britain probably rightly realized that we could not maintain a massive naval presence on basically every theater: the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, and the Far East. So Japan was more than willing to form an alliance with Britain if that essentially meant that China would be kept down, but primarily Russia would be kept down. We had been fighting a Cold War with Russia basically since the 1830s. And what our alliance with Japan did essentially was allow the annihilation of a prospective Russian empire in Asia and a massive naval presence of Russia in the Pacific Ocean. That was destroyed before it was basically allowed to grow. And that was as a result of the Japanese basically fighting a war for us by proxy, which is why I've always seen it. Essentially, we were able to destroy the Russian Empire in the East without a shot being fired, which is why the alliance was so successful. In a similar way, you can say the French alliance was supposed to be, or rather the French Entente, not formal alliance, was supposed to be the counterpart for that. And that is part of the reason why the Kaiser precipitated the original Moroccan crisis, because he essentially believed that this was test the strength of the cordial arrangement, but in reality, it strengthened it as opposed to broke it apart, which was his original intention. So that's one question: bringing up the idea of Spain, the idea of France, and the idea of Italy in terms of Britain going away from this idea of splendid isolation and becoming involved in these entanglements. But like I said, it actually makes sense to some degree to actually rely on other powers, or at least diplomatically support other powers, if they're going to do your bidding for you without having to expend more resources at a time where Britain was losing its economic dominance in the world. By 1900, Germany and the United States had already overtaken us in the world of global economics. So in terms of understanding that the world has changed, we can no longer assume a position of economic as well as naval and military hegemon. So it therefore makes sense to rely on these smaller powers to prevent the rise of greater powers. So I find it interesting bringing up the Spanish example, which Pat Buchanan brings up but doesn't really elaborate, because to me it offers almost a counterpoint to what happened with Russia and the Japanese alliance. Now we come back finally to Italy. Italy was a growing but rather inept, expanding colonial and imperial power throughout the first half of the 20th century. They were able to gain possessions at the expense of the Ottomans in Rhodes and Libya, but they lost decisively against the Ethiopians and were only able to acquire the coastline, Eritrea and Somaliland. But nevertheless, we embraced the Italians as allies in the First World War with the promise of basically taking over territories from the Turks and the Austrians. So we essentially have created a series of alliances beyond that merely of France. And Pat Buchanan's point regarding the progression essentially of the interwar years is that we lost all these powers, and we lost them due to diplomatic incompetence among various other factors. So one major point he brings up, because we talked about naval power throughout all of this, are the Washington naval conferences. Prior to the First World War, our understanding of naval power had basically been the two-power principle, that Britain must control a navy which is more powerful than the next two navies combined. As a result of again, but also consider one of the ostensible reasons why people like Winston Churchill as the First Lord of the Admiralty was so gung-ho about fighting the Germans was to preserve Britain's naval supremacy. Well, after the war, very shortly after the war, as a result of American cajoling, but more as a result, you can say, of the deference of British politicians, we decided to radically change our naval position, and you can say the fate of the British Empire forever, by adopting limitations and quotas on power. But they weren't really limitations and quotas on power, so much as they were limitations and quotas of power simply on the British and not on the other powers. Basically, the Washington Conference allowed the Americans to build a new navy which had parity with Great Britain, and they allowed the Japanese to establish a navy which had a strength of 60% of that in capital ships of Great Britain. But bear in mind, Japan was just one power in one region, as opposed to Britain, which basically operated out of every strategic theatre. So that in itself set up, you can say, the military disparity between Japan and Britain that would cause the doom of the British Empire in the East during the Second World War. But all this is, again, to mention is that we actually favored this Washington Conference that so damaged us versus the renewal of our alliance with Japan. The alliance with Japan that not only had allowed us to defeat Russia by proxy, but allowed us to basically seize the German colonies and the German concessions in China during the First World War. We
Churchill,
abandoned.
Churchill was also on a tirade to, like on a budgetary tirade, trying to um, basically make sure the budget was balanced at the expense of the navy.
Well, yes, Churchill, having defected from the Conservatives to the Liberals, then realized after 1923 that the Liberals were a doomed prospect. So he again defected from the Liberals to the Conservatives. And for his treachery, he was given the post of Chancellor of the Exchequer. And again, just to illustrate your earlier point of a total sort of policy contradiction here, having essentially jettisoned Japan as an ally to favor the Americans, again, inexplicably, given the hostile course Japan would then take after that, given the fact that we then pursued the Washington Naval Agreement, Churchill then went on essentially a policy of uh, stringency and retrenchment and austerity regarding the Royal Navy, when it was the Royal Navy essentially that was the defining feature of Britain's endurance as an imperial power. So, but it's more than that. What the stipulations of the Washington Conference essentially stated, as Pat Buchanan declares, is that America, in terms of being able to bring itself up to the power of Britain, was building new ships, because this was all done on tonnage and battleship displacement. So we kept our old ships, and America was building newer ships, more modern ships. So not only was America building as many ships as we were, but they had a technological edge over our ships as well. And as we see later, again, this isn't actually something weirdly he references, but the basis for destroyers, even before America entered the Second World War, the expansion of the US Navy was used as a tool without firing a single shot to dismantle the British Empire by giving their obsolete ships to us in return for establishing the series of bases which are now basically the military presence that the United States has across the world today. It really is rather remarkable. But in terms of, you can say, the original transfer of power, because this is only representing one aspect. We're only talking about naval power here. We're not talking about the fact, I've already mentioned the fact that economically the United States overtook us before the First World War. Well, after the Second World War, they overtook us as the main financial power in the world. And indeed, you can say it was their failure to sort of become entrenched in the League of Nations that doomed it as a project to start. And of course, but like I said, even though they weren't part of the League of Nations, they still had the power, as a result of British acquiescence, to jettison alliances that were essentially in our interest. So already you can say the tenor of actions that would define our relationship, the quote unquote special relationship, which is probably the most horrific euphemism that's ever been created. Um, that special relationship is being defined even prior, perhaps, to the First World War. It's definitely apparent during the interwar years. And we mentioned Japan being lost to us as an ally. I mentioned the counterfactual example of the prospect of Spain. But now we finally come to your point, which is the question of Italy. Um, Italy, contrary to expectations, fascism in Italy was actually lauded quite consistently by many politicians in the West, because especially compared to National Socialism, with the exception of the rather horrendous sort of death of Matteotti, the socialist MP, fascism was comparatively rather benign. Yeah, when the black shirts and Mussolini went around killing people, they did so in the dozens and not the thousands. And also, he was able to bring, you can say, stability to Italy after the post-war years. He was able to restore an element of Italian pride after the mutilated victory in Italy, they call it, having failed to gain all the concessions they wanted. And so fascism was seen as a civilizational force. And indeed, Mussolini wasn't seen as that much of a rabid irredentist. He was rather seen as a potential ally of Britain due to the power of the Italian Royal Navy and the fact that you could say Italy's possessions in the Mediterranean could augment British power in the Dodecanese, in the Adriatic, in the Western Mediterranean, as opposed to act as a counter to it. And indeed, when we have the election of Adolf Hitler in 1933, we see a preemptive attempt by the Austrian National Socialist Party to take over Austria. Well, Italy had its own ideas about a sphere of influence in Europe, and their sphere of influence rested on Hungary as part of the Pact of Rome, but it also involved Austria. And you can say these were the quote unquote sort of Catholic opposition powers to National Socialist Germany, because all of these governments were rightist in some way. They were avowedly Catholic, even though I believe Admiral Horthy was technically a Calvinist. And
Mhm.
indeed, in Schuschnigg in Austria,
Reminds me, just reminds me a little bit of obviously Horthy and the current prime minister. Oh, what's his name? In Hungary, they're both Calvinists, but they both ostensibly rule over Catholic countries.
well, it's just interesting, isn't it, that oh my God, I've forgotten his name. I remember the party Fidesz. Someone in the chat has to. But again, it's one of these names that's always there, but I've forgotten it now. But anyway, Orban, Viktor Orban.
There you go. Yeah.
Well, isn't it fascinating that Horthy and Viktor Orban, both Calvinists, ruling over, you can say, Catholic regimes, and then
Mhm.
you have Biden, a Catholic, ruling over a, I don't know, a Satanist regime.
Yeah. Yes, the comparison is quite bizarre. I don't understand how, though Orban is married to a Catholic, so I guess that's something.
Well, I mean, this is going on another tangent because I just referenced this as part of Italy, but just to indulge it slightly, there is an aristocratic quality in Hungary to actually not being a Catholic, weirdly enough. Hungary had a very large magnate class, lesser nobles, essentially, and many of them during the Protestant Reformation went over to become Calvinists. The Ottomans actually played a pivotal role in terms of trying to convert many of the Hungarian aristocrats into becoming Calvinists, because of course that would be used against the Habsburgs and the Austrians.
Just
So as
weirdest thing ever.
so as a result of that, you have that legacy, which is basically a Calvinist Protestant elite represented by aspects of the Hungarian nobility, not all aspects. I mean, the Esterházys would be the most unequivocal sort of counter to that. But nevertheless, it is there. But nevertheless, that you can say aristocratic Calvinism has been able to assimilate itself within Catholic Hungary. You can say almost this is the dream example of what happened in the French wars of religion, when you had a Calvinist aristocracy presiding over a Catholic country. Of course, in France that ended in disaster, but in Hungary, weirdly, you reach some sort of bizarre harmony, which was sort of achieved in the late period. But anyway, going back to Italy, the point I bring up with Italy is basically to demarcate that Mussolini was not yet a lackey of Hitler. He understood Italy's own self-interest, and extending out beyond the Mediterranean, which he believed would eventually become an Italian sea, he essentially formed an alliance with the two victimized parties as a result of the treaties of Saint-Germain and Trianon, Austria and Hungary. And of course, this would seem antithetical to National Socialist German interest, because they wanted Anschluss, they wanted the unification of Austria with Germany. And when the Austrian National Socialist Party attempted to do this in 1934, Mussolini intervened decisively to support Schuschnigg after the assassination of Dollfuss. And this, if anything, would indicate that more so than what we say later of France and Britain in the ensuing years, Mussolini was actually far more hardline in his opposition to Germany and his defense of Italy's self-interest than the powers that will eventually go to war with it, as bizarre as that may seem. And as a result of this, we see the creation of the quote-unquote Stresa Front. Elements of the sort of right side of the radical faction in France, Pierre Laval most prominently, allying with the fascists in Italy to prevent essentially more irredentist claims by now National Socialist Germany. Indeed, it's actually quite interesting ideologically that this went beyond pure sort of power politics, but Mussolini actually sort of morally broke with Hitler after the Night of Long Knives, when Ernst Röhm, Kurt von Schleicher, and other prominent anti-Nazis were killed, coinciding with the death of von Hindenburg, which allowed Hitler to assume the powers of head of state and chancellor. So that's another interesting angle to it. But to point out, Britain had a potential ally in Italy, and this all foundered basically over the issue of Abyssinia. Mussolini wanted to gain control over Abyssinia for reasons of, you can say, pure power politics, but also you can say symbolic reasons in terms of avenging the first debacle of Italy's attempt to conquer Abyssinia some 40 years before. And of course, Abyssinia was surrounded by Italian possessions on the north and the east, and Mussolini essentially made the point that how is it Britain can control all of East Africa, India, most of Asia, and all of the white settler colonies, but Italy can't control Abyssinia. And of course, the same example could be used against France. And what Pat Buchanan basically goes on to state is that we adopted the worst of all policies. Mussolini's basically first intention towards Abyssinia was to annex part of the economically rich areas, whilst the actual Haile Selassie would be left with a rump of Ethiopia in the center. But as a result of the incompetence of the British position, the failure of negotiations, and then the creation of an embargo, we essentially prevented these negotiations coming to fruition. And rather than Haile Selassie losing half of his empire, he lost all of his empire. So what essentially the British achieved in 1935, 1936 is the complete destruction of an independent Abyssinia and the alienation of Italy, which is, quite an incredible goal to have been able to achieve both the annihilation of an ally and the ostracization of another potential ally. And bear in mind, like I said, prior to 1936, Mussolini could have been a very effective force in terms of checking Hitler's southern flank. And indeed, in terms of considering other counterfactuals, I've always wondered whether Italy could have still gone to war with Germany in 1939, 1940, had, say, for example, Stalin been brought over and formed basically an alliance with Hitler as a result of the war in Finland. And again, you can say there's almost the prospect of creating proxy wars everywhere against both Hitler and Stalin, and whether Japan and Italy could be enticed into attacking both Germany and the Soviet Union. All interesting prospects, but I believe up until 1940, there was a logic behind the Italians forming an alliance with us. And again, in terms of trade-offs, the Italians would essentially lose the prospect of annexing Egypt and Sudan, which would link all their Italian possessions together in Africa. But in return for adopting an anti-German alliance, the Italians would get a sphere of influence in the Balkans. So, like I said, there was a logic for Mussolini joining. And what Pat Buchanan explains that, as with Japan, we deliberately alienated our alliances, so our potential allies. So if there was a plan to go to war with Hitler, we did everything to weaken ourselves before declaring war in 1939.
Indeed. Also, part of this is set up by sort of the buying in of the League of Nations. The League of Nations, as you said, the United States did not join, but it was the brainchild of Woodrow Wilson. These ideas of the League of Nations and Woodrow Wilson basically had seemingly taken over British foreign policy and removed any actual strategy to maintain the British, well, uh, maintain the British status quo, and instead hindered it on sort of these ideological grounds that don't make a lot of sense, because it's not like Ethiopia was some uh, example of liberal democracy from
Well,
their
no, I
perspective.
mean the concessions that Pat Buchanan brings up a load of contemporary views, even Churchill's views in Abyssinia, which is, we can't look at Abyssinia in the same way that we looked at Belgium. To equivocate would basically be absurd. And of course, what happened when Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, a lot of Abyssinian tribes actually came up and joined the Italians because they hated Haile Selassie. Because even today, Ethiopia is a multi-ethnic, multilinguistic state, and Haile Selassie only represented, if I remember, the Amhara, which are just one tribe within the makeup of Ethiopia. Ethiopia, by the way, historically was much smaller than it is. I think it was, again, going off memory, it was Emperor Melik in the 1890s who was able to gain recognition of a much larger Ethiopia, albeit one that didn't expand to the sea. So you can say, as with many things, that Ethiopia's borders, as much as with all of the new borders in Europe, was a bit of a contrivance. So yes, the common assumption was basically, we have done everything wrong regarding our Abyssinian policy. We did not stand firm to protect it, or we did not basically turn a blind eye to it, which would have been basically the only two positions we could have taken. Indeed, it's actually quite prescient because one Emmanuel Macron at the moment has been lauded for his strategic ambiguity, is the word to describe his inexplicable genius that we are all supposed to buy into, regarding his xenophobia and then placatory attitudes towards Putin. Yeah, we are going to wage war with you on the one hand, and actually, no, we are a force for peace 2 minutes later. So maybe, again, Britain was a pioneer of strategic ambiguity when it came to the Italian Abyssinian question in 1935-6.
Indeed. Now, you sort of brought up the Stresa front and the aspects of, you have this, sort of, you have Austria, you have Hungary, you have Italy, but surrounding them is also the Little Entente, that could have also been maintained, which is Yugoslavia, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. Which, in that case, if the alliance with Italy was maintained against Hitler by France and Britain, is basically, you have Germany surrounded on all sides, and even Munich wouldn't have been a necessary thing, even strategically, to try to, like, give in to Hitler at the Munich conference.
Well, but this brings up several things you've already alluded to, in particular Wilson and the League of Nations. So this is a good idea to sort of come back to the Paris peace treaties. But maybe Charles Coulomb will appreciate this idea I'm going to posit here, which is that the stability of Europe in the abstract, should have relied on a natural alliance between Austria and France as two great powers throughout the 19th century, two sort of great Catholic conservative powers. But any sort of notion of that was sort of destroyed in the 1870s. But the reason I bring that up is because the creation of the Little Entente followed that same logic, which was the creation of a French-aligned power bloc in the Central Europe. And of course, the irony is Austria, from being a Catholic monarchical power, the diabolical regime of Czechoslovakia was basically a regime built in the image of France as if to replicate its own values. But of course, despite being the quote unquote great democracy in Central Europe, it was a Czech state in a multi ethnic empire that was sustained through a process of ostracization and gerrymandering. And this, you can say, represents the antithesis of the quote unquote ideas of self determination. There is actually a considerable amount of revisionism when it comes to, I don't know, what is it, the peacemakers. Um, if I remember correctly, I'm just looking it up now, there's a book that came out 4 years ago by Margaret Macmillan, who attempts to argue that there was actually incredible foresight behind the peacemakers. And you can say this is compounding the idea of revisionism, which would basically be the antithesis to Pat Buchanan, not going away from the idea simply that World War II was justified, but World War I was ultimately justified, and that the peace stemming from it was also justified. But the fundamental, you can say that's the most extreme example, but the fundamental contradiction coming out of Wilson is something I actually unpacked quite extensively, because I looked into Wilson in 1916 and 1917 before the declaration of war, which is the idea that Wilson believed ostensibly in a peace without victory. What that essentially means is peace without annexations, peace without indemnities, or you can say a complete redefinition of what it means to fight a war, and you can say a process towards the eradication of war as a concept in and of itself. And this idea was still something that endured beyond the American declaration of war in Germany in April of 1917. And it was actually something that the Germans themselves attached themselves to in terms of the deliverance of their own state. And this compounds the idea of the stab in the back. The stab in the back wasn't just talking about domestic opposition, but it was actually targeted at the Americans. Because when Germany created the armistice in November of 1918, it was with the assumption that Wilson, as the most powerful actor within the conference, would proceed with a peace without victory. Instead, after the armistice, and just before the armistice, I mean, just think about it. Why ultimately was the Kaiser overthrown?
Basically because he was a easy person to blame.
Yes, precisely, but more than that. Uh, the German military basically told him to pack his bags and go to the Netherlands so that they could the Germans produce a regime which was amenable to good terms for a peace. And that was essentially the logic. You know, we are going to change our political situation to make ourselves compatible with your goal of a peace without victors. But after having agreed to the armistice, the British maintained their starvation blockade against the Germans. It's really a misnomer to say that we stopped going to war against Germany in 1918. Really, the war didn't end until midway through, until June 1919, because what nation under peace maintains a blockade which results in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians? But that is, of course, what was maintained. And of course, during that time, from November of 1918 until June of 1919, Germany lost its empire in the East. German morale in the army collapsed. There was a socialist revolution in Berlin led by the Spartakists and Rosa Luxemburg. In Bavaria, Kurt Eisner set up a Bavarian Communist Republic. The demobilized troops essentially became the Freikorps and instituted their own version, essentially, of extrajudicial justice in terms of being able to allow some sort of stability in Germany. And the new regime under Friedrich Ebert, the democratic socialist, essentially had to lean on all of these powers in order to prevent Germany from collapsing. because, like I said, there'd already been the precedent of Bavarian secession and the idea of a Bolshevik-sponsored world revolution in 1918, 1919. But Germany held together. Germany was able to establish the Weimar Republic, which by all accounts seems to be a regime built in the mirror image of France, the quote-unquote victor. And instead, they were presented with terms at the Treaty of Versailles that were definitely the stipulations of a conquering power imposing a peace, emphasis on imposing a peace on a conquered party. And this had been far more extreme than the impositions of the earlier Great Peace at the Congress of Vienna, where France had been allowed to participate in negotiations. These were not deliberations. This was an ultimatum which would be imposed by a military occupation had the Germans not acceded, and the continuation of the starvation blockade. So every punitive military measure was utilized to impose this peace on the Germans. So even in terms of the methods, regardless of the actual implications of the treaty, the Germans were horrified by the lengths the Allies would go in terms of being able to humiliate her. But also look at the territorial concessions. The Germans basically had made peace with the idea of losing Alsace and Lorraine. Yeah, that was a foregone conclusion. That was France's primary war goal at the expense of the Germans. But beyond the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, you have the loss of Eupen and Malmedy in Belgium. You have the loss of North Schleswig, which Denmark hadn't even been a participant in that war.
Mm.
To Poland, which had been essentially a creation of Germany in late 1915, in late 1916, Germany and Austria. Poland gained parts of southern Prussia. They gained the quote-unquote Polish corridor. They gained technical control over Danzig, even though Danzig was a quote-unquote free city. And they established themselves in the industrial areas in Upper Silesia, and they even expanded into the Austrian regions and quickly adopted the region of Teschen before the Czechs then came back and took that region from them. And they were also involved in a war against the Soviet Union that would define the size of the borders, whether at the Curzon line, which would basically be the borders now, or the Far Eastern line, which would be to the borders of modern day Minsk. And as you mentioned, as someone in the chat is mentioning, this is very much a Carthaginian peace. War guilt was basically positioned on the Germans to basically justify the legitimacy of these actions. Germany had to pay a massive indemnity. Germany had to demilitarize the Rhineland, which was a core factor of France basically buying into the peace. But the French wanted to go further. The two ideas posited were that France either annex that region or France create a secessionist breakaway government, which, funny enough, would be controlled by one Konrad Adenauer, the man who would later become Chancellor of Germany in the 1940s and 1950s. So all of these ideas were positioned. But you can say that Germany actually, this was the worst of all treaties, which is something Pat Buchanan goes into. It was sufficiently punitive, and the delivery mechanism was so humiliating as to create a feeling of total hostility between the German population and the Allied powers. Yet at the same time, it wasn't punitive enough to prevent the Germans being able to come back and restore their possessions. So, if anything, if you're going to destroy Germany forever, you're going to come out and say, well, just France, just annex, not just the Tsar, annex the Rhineland. Poland, annex everything up into the Oder-Neissau line. What have you, give a slab of, I don't know, northwest, give the old Oldenburg Duchy back to Denmark, back to the Netherlands or something like that. Give more territory to Belgium. I don't know, because all of this is artificial, essentially. France had been eclipsed by Germany in the 19th century. And ever since, Germany has been the most populous and the most sort of economically valuable region in Europe, with the exception of Russia. And all of this was an artificial means of ensuring French superiority vis-a-vis Germany. But of course, in addition to all of this not only smacked against the idea of Wilson's peace without victory, but it also smacked against this idea of self-determination. Because what better way for the Germans to actually buy into this new holy order of making the world a safer democracy than by allowing Austria and the Germans in the Sudeten region to join in with the new quote-unquote democratic Germany? But of course, they were denied this, their own willing sort of act of self-determination. The Germans in Bohemia and Moravia had to be attached to Czechoslovakia, which they did not want to belong, and Austria had to remain detached, even though in 1918, 1919, that was the time where union would have been most conducive due to the fact that Karl Rainer and Friedrich Ebert were in power concurrently. But of course, this was denied. And not only that, as Pat Buchanan goes on to explain, even a customs union, which would have facilitated economic growth between the powers, was denied as well. Austria was to essentially remain its entire economy dependent on the goodwill of the Entente powers, and any measure to remedy that or form into an alliance with Germany would have resulted in economically crippling sanctions. So, like I said, everything was done not only to show the hypocrisy of essentially the hypocrisy of Wilson on every level. And this is even ignoring, this is just Germany. Germany was very lightly treated compared to somewhere like Hungary. Hungary, ironically, which was the greater peace power within the Austro-Hungarian pact under Istvan Tisza, which then turned out to lose 70% of its territory as a result of this. And this comes back to your point about the Little Entente. What was the Little Entente ultimately? It was a contrivance to create a French counterpower structure in Eastern Europe based on Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, all with massively expanded borders. And this was to essentially establish a cordon sanitaire around Germany, around Austria, and Hungary. So, to hell with this idea of a peace without victors. This entire treaty established, you can say, a geographical enmity towards the defeated powers. In fact, I will go so far as to say that poor little Hungary's borders now and today are basically designed to facilitate a foreign invasion.
Yeah. I mean, in some sense, it was all, the dismantling of Hungary was a forcible thing. It wasn't like by treaty exactly. I mean, treaty formalized it, but Romania had invaded. Um, I'm not sure. Did the other powers as well that took pieces
The
invade?
saddest thing about Hungary is that towards the end of October 1918, we have the Asta Revolution by Karolyi, and Hungary preemptively disarmed in order to form a good relation with the Entente powers. Retroactively, Hungary basically prostrated themselves towards the French, which had been coming out of Serbia, and saying, "We are not going to fight you. We are going to reform our relations with the Slovaks, the Transylvanian Romanians. We are going to keep this basically as a new confederation. We are going to be the Switzerland of the Carpathians," was the line given. And we are basically a power for peace. Then what happened to Hungary in the ensuing years? They were overtaken by a communist revolution under Bela Kun. That communist revolution was deposed by the Romanian army, which then occupied large swaths of that territory. And the remnant, which was able to basically form any sort of power structure, ultimately under Regent Horthy, who came in and basically eliminated the communists. That rump was treated harsher than any of the other foreign powers. So, like I said, if you look to the legacy of the Asta Revolution, the Hungarians have an even greater cause than the Germans in terms of pointing to this idea of betrayal.
Indeed. But anyway, so that sums up sort of the reasons for the failure of Versailles and the
No, there are two reasons for the failure of Versailles, because this didn't have to fail. Either you say, well, the contradictions don't matter. We have established this. It is in our interest to set up this order and say that, yes, okay, Czechoslovakia is just as multi-ethnic as the Austro-Hungarian Empire that preceded it. So what? Czechoslovakia is a strategic imperative for French security in Europe. What the Allies ended up doing, by the Allies I mean Britain and France, is they tacitly agreed to the moral argument made by Germany and Hungary, which was its failing. They went so far as basically to say that you're wrong, that we were wrong, but they didn't go as far as enough to say we were so wrong that we are prepared to wholesale transform the map of Europe to remedy this situation, which is essentially what Germany wanted. Either you stand firm and say this is the way things are, or you basically offer a complete capitulation. And as we see with Italy, they did the worst of both worlds. They surrendered their allies, they alienated others, they disbanded their own new sort of post-war structure in Central and Eastern Europe. And as a result of that, they made themselves significantly weaker when they eventually offered the guarantee to Poland. So, like I said, if you're going to go to war with Germany, it just reeks of incompetence. And indeed, something else that Pat Buchanan tries to emphasize is that Hitler did not have a master plan. The expansion of Germany was very ad hoc and slapdash and opportunistic. Yes, in Mein Kampf, there were certain ideologically sort of predestined points, but there wasn't basically a roadmap of how to get there. By predestined points, I mean the destruction of Bolshevism, the essentially the ostracization and disempowerment of Germany's Jewry, and the reunification of all Germans in the Reich, a home in the Reich, where essentially all Germans were to be repatriated and belong to one state. Those were the clear sort of overarching aims of National Socialism. But as we see, Hitler was able to achieve many of these aims through luck, ostensibly.
Yes.
It started off badly in 1934 when he preemptively tried to form an alliance with the Austrian National Socialists, who blundered in their attempt to establish a coup against Dollfuss and Schuschnigg. But he succeeded a year later in the Tsar, when that was a region that basically voted to become part of National Socialist Germany by an overwhelming majority, I think by 90%, in supervised elections, which again was a huge moral victory to Germany, saying, okay, by your own grounds of self-determination, the whole Tsar experiment for France was, again, a result of a conqueror's peace, a Carthaginian peace. Then Germany occupies the Rhineland. And again, Pat Buchanan actually advocates a very interesting idea here, which is that Hitler was intelligent enough to actually conceive of his reoccupation of the Rhineland within the terms of the Locarno Pact. For people who don't know, the Locarno Pact was under Gustav Stresemann 10 years earlier in 1925, whereby Germany, not as a result of a punitive peace treaty, but Germany proactively decided to recognize the borders with France and the demilitarization of the Rhineland into perpetuity. And this, if anything, for both Germany and France, had far more moral weight than the Treaty of Versailles, because it was a pact entered into willingly as opposed to imposed. Before Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, of course, which was one of the most, you can say, risky moves, given the fact that Germany was not prepared militarily to resist France had she chosen to intervene. The significant thing about this is that Hitler actually justified this by saying France had violated the Locarno Pact, and thereby Germany was not bound to honor its terms. And by that, I believe 1 month before the occupation of the Rhineland, France had formed a basis of a understanding, or basically a precursor to an alliance with the Soviet Union. That was seen as a hostile move, and thereby France had broken the pact, and Germany was essentially right under the terms of the pre-National Socialist government to restore that territory. In the same way, in the year before, Germany basically sought a British approval to rebuild its navy, and the British agreed.
Mhm.
So, by all of these measures, Germany was actually in the right. It was doing everything, with the exception of Austria. Germany was actually going about it in a quote unquote legal fashion based on the redress of the treaties, rather than basically seizing these territories by force, until we come to the case of Austria. But again, as Pat Buchanan basically points it out, Schuschnigg, in a sense, preempted the occupation of Austria by attempting to hold a referendum, which would basically say, are we forever Austrians or are we forever Germans? That move was unnecessary. And there's a question as to whether, had he decided not to hold that referendum, whether Germany would have actually had any impetus to actually annex Austria, given the question of Italy and the possible Italian intervention in Austria again. And what actually happened in terms of the Anschluss was a very haphazard affair, but miraculously one that didn't boil down into civil war or fighting. And you can say that the reason this house of cards fell apart is because Schuschnigg ultimately had to rely on anti-German factors such as the socialists in Vienna, which meant that the Catholic pretensions, you could say, of his government were under incredibly sort of shaky grounds and could have only been sustained by foreign interventionism, by fascist Italy, and indeed by Hungary, neither of which was strong enough really in 1938 to resist. In the same way that Buchanan points out that with Czechoslovakia, Edvard Beneš had manufactured a quote-unquote May crisis in 1938 to humiliate Germany with this whole phantom annexation of the Sudetenland. But if anything, that was a claim for Germany to seek some sort of diplomatic redress. And when it comes to the Munich conference, had Hitler actually gone to war with Czechoslovakia in 1938, he would have most likely been deposed by the army, by Beck, because Germany was not prepared to go to war with the Entente in 1938, and Hitler had massively underestimated the strength of the Czech fortifications in the Sudeten Mountains, meaning that had Germany gone in against a motivated Czechoslovakia, they would have likely been massacred, and they would have had to fight a war on the Western Front before they were ready. So, weirdly enough, in 1938, if there was ever going to be a moment to actually prevent Hitler from expanding and possibly preempt a coup from within Germany itself to arrest him and remove him from power, that was the opportunity. But instead, Chamberlain made a preemptive attempt to secure peace in our time by offering Czechoslovakia to the Germans. And all the assumptions made by Czechoslovakia basically being a buoyant and defensive power, willing essentially to take the fight to Germany, proved to be a complete farce because Edvard Beneš, the man who had manufactured the May crisis in 1938, fled to the country, and the new government of Czechoslovakia basically conceded the Sudeten region. And with it, they conceded the defensibility of the state. France stood by and allowed this to happen. And that, in a sense, basically delegitimated the whole process again of the West actively seeking alliances to curb a potential conflict with Hitler. So, like I said, if that was the goal, they went about it incompetently. And again, that's a part of Pat Buchanan's point. It's not just an argument as to whether this was unnecessary from a grand strategy perspective, i.e., did the British Empire need to go to war with Germany in the abstract, or was there some sort of moral argument to go to war with Germany? No, his argument is also, if you're going to go to war with Germany, you went about it in the most incompetent way you could have possibly done. So he's approaching this on many levels, which makes it, all the more interesting. And the only way you can sort of purchase into this idea is to go away from the idea that Hitler was some sort of diabolical genius who hoodwinked the West, but rather, he was adopting an incredibly risky strategy, which was spontaneous. And the West essentially adopted a policy which was disastrous, contradictory, and ultimately resulted in the destruction of the French and the British empires. And yeah, that's your Munich question, but I'll
Yeah.
probably leave it there.
Well, you brought up a lot of stuff, and in the case of Rhineland, I just want to on the remilitarization of the Rhineland. I just want to point out that Britain's mentality, if I'm not mistaken, was that if France isn't going to defend the Rhineland, or isn't going to, make any military objection to the reoccupation of the Rhine or remilitarization of the Rhineland, then why should we care? That's, sort of the British mentality there, and then the French just aren't in any mood to do so. And
Well, I
then
mean, he points out that France had actually preemptively evacuated the Rhineland. There was supposed to be an occupation force at least until 1935, but in a goodwill gesture towards the then German Chancellor Brüning, the French had left in 1930. And there's another very interesting point, because again, one of the reasons why this book is basically entirely discounted by the academic consensus is the fact that Pat Buchanan engages in counterfactuals. And that is the basis, you can say, of most of his arguments. But again, like I said, it's intellectually dishonest to simply dismiss counterfactuals as basically saying it's not real history, when in reality, like I said, these events make far more sense in terms of trying to understand the possibilities of the actors involved, presented essentially what possibilities were presented to them, or what possibilities they intend to sort of invent, essentially, rather than just saying everything happened in a premeditated fashion. which is again a teleological and ultimately you can say not just fatalistic but stupid and self-defeating way of looking at history. And most good historians know this, and most engage in a degree of counterfactuals. But again, it's a way to smugly dismiss Pat Buchanan's book as, basically on the one hand as some sort of Nazi apologist on the one hand, and on the other hand saying that oh, this is all just alternative history anyway. They land the same sort of accusation against Niall Ferguson, even though Niall Ferguson is, I would say, intellectually nowhere near the caliber of Pat Buchanan, even though Pat Buchanan isn't a historian. And I say this because Niall Ferguson, again, I say the weakest point of Pat Buchanan's back is the fact that he relies too much on Niall Ferguson re World War One. And recently, I've come to the understanding that Niall Ferguson's position of World War One is mostly false. I've sort of completely recontextualized that position. But again, this book is primarily about World War Two rather than it is about World War One. So I wouldn't want to lean too much on that. So
Um, well, so the remilitarization of the Rhineland, and then you perfectly summed up the situation in Austria and Czechoslovakia. But the interesting thing I've always thought about Austria is that when the invasion or when the Anschluss took place, the plan had been called Operation Otto, and it makes your point that what France should have been looking for was this Central
restoration of the
European,
Habsburgs, yes,
well,
ironically.
but also just a Central European ally. I mean, it had set that up with the Little Entente to some degree, but they set it up and didn't follow through. And I think, to be honest, the Little Entente was a bit inept, given the fact that it was a sort of a fiction. It was a creation out of nothing to some degree.
Yes, it was a creation out of nothing, but you have to bear in mind that Czechoslovakia, throughout most of the 1920s and early 1930s, had a larger army than Germany,
Hmm.
even though it had a population of at least a quarter. So Czechoslovakia was basically a armed fortress in the center of Europe. Even more inexplicable that you decide basically to give it over to Germany, because not only was it a fortress, it was also it was also one of the largest manufacturing bases in Europe. When Germany gained the Skoda works in Bohemia after the occupation in spring of 1939, they gained the largest manufacturing center outside of the Ruhr. So Czechoslovakia as a state, irrespective of the completely sort of artificial ethnic creation that it was, and again, just to emphasize this, in order to find some sort of precedent for the borders of Czechoslovakia, you have to go to Greater Moravia in, I think, the 8th century in order to find any state which somewhat fills in the borders of that in terms of some sort of Czech and Slovak unity. But like I said, it's better to almost look at the region before 1945 as Bohemia and Moravia, because it was both German and Czech, and that situation had existed since the 13th century. So the idea that you could go from a German dynasty, the Habsburgs, and there's also another argument. I mean, I presented the idea that France and Central Europe are best aligned, under some sort of Catholic legitimism, whether it be the Comte de Chambord in France and Franz Josef in Austria. But of course, because Czechoslovakia was imitating France in all the wrong ways now that France was the Third Republic and was basically I wouldn't say an atheistic, but a secularist regime. Czechoslovakia, or rather Bohemia and Moravia, went from being one of the most Catholic regions in Europe to becoming one of the most atheistic regions in Europe, which is a state that basically exists up until now. So yes, I mean, it was an incredible sort of turnaround in so many respects in terms of the creation of Czechoslovakia. But like I said, if you're France and you're wanting to maintain this fiction, this hypocrisy, which is the Treaty of Versailles and the broader Paris pieces, you have to hold this thing together. And combined to that, you have Romania and you have Yugoslavia. And with the possible ally of Italy, it is actually quite viable to connect this together. And then, of course, you're linking this to, and again, someone in the chat is saying there is also, has to be mentioned, a Masonic aspect to this. But someone in the chat is mentioning there wasn't really an alternative. All surrounding states hated the Czech government. Well, like I said, yes, there is a degree to which the Czechs were hated by the Austrians, they were hated by the Hungarians, they were hated by the Germans, they were also to some degree hated by the Poles. But nevertheless, Poland would have done much better with an alliance with the Little Entente, not just Romania, uh, and had basically conceded the loss of Tetchin rather than allowing it to be partitioned by Germany and the Soviet Union, which is ultimately what happened. Because the only ally that really remains to the Allies after the loss of Poland is Romania. And as we finally find out, that's not really an ally at all. So it's not correct to say that all the other surrounding states hated the Czech government. There's even the possibility that any alliance concluded between Czechoslovakia and Poland to resurrect the intermarium, the alliance between the seas, may have involved some repatriation of Czech territories. And again, if you're thinking of trade-offs, Czechoslovakia, for a Polish ally, loses Tetchin, or in order to concede to Germany, it loses the Sudetenland. One is more valuable than the other. So what I'm talking about, as Pat Buchanan is talking about, are possibilities. And if you're trying to either prevent German expansion or you're preparing for war, the Allies went about it in the worst possible way they could. And this probably gets us, in terms of the chronology of all this, to the guarantee to Poland, which, from Pat Buchanan's point of view, is the most inexplicable event of them all. And what prompts this is that in 1939, the rump of Czechoslovakia collapses, and it had been basically the German design to collapse Czechoslovakia. Like I said, the brilliance of annexing the Sudeten region and later Hungary annexing southern Slovakia is that there was essentially nothing defending the Czech state. The legitimacy of the Czech state had basically been undone by the Great Western Betrayal. Its multi-ethnic and thereby artificial status had been exposed. Its leader, Edvard Beneš, had fled. Thomas Masaryk, the founding father, was dead. And so the Germans, along with the Hungarians, not only wanted to seize territory, but they wanted to split the Czechs now from the Slovaks. And so what prompted the German annexation was finally the Slovak Declaration of Independence, and Hitler took the decision basically to walk into Bohemia without any sort of combined opposition. And it's sort of remarkable that within the space of 6 months, Hitler was able to occupy the most sort of hostile regime in Europe, Central Europe, without a shot being fired. But that is essentially what happens. And like I said, if the Allies were going to support it, they would have had to have supported it in the days of Munich. But what this does, Chamberlain basically looks at this and says, okay, well, the next target is going to be Poland, because more so than Bohemia, which is predominantly Czech, the Germans have the best claim for the city of Danzig. Danzig, which is entirely German. Danzig is far more German today than London is English. I mean, by magnitudes more. And if there is going to be some sort of, easy coup for Germany, it will be involving the repatriation of the League of Nations city, which is basically controlled by Poland, back into Germany. And that becomes the next point. And indeed, Hitler had already made overtures to Joseph Beck in the winter of 1938, 1939. But what Chamberlain, and actually more specifically Lord Halifax, the British Foreign Minister, takes from this is that any possible negotiation between Poland and Germany over the restitution of things such as Danzig or the Polish corridor or what have you must include the defense of Polish sovereignty, i.e., we can't let what happened to Czechoslovakia happen to Poland. Poland must remain an independent, viable state. And so they issue the quote-unquote Polish guarantee. And I believe, as Pat Buchanan alludes to, is that the logic behind this was not an attempt to stymie negotiations, but in fact an invitation to negotiations between Germany and Poland, i.e., Britain and France will allow you to come to some sort of historic redress of these territories so long as Poland remains an independent state and we don't see a repeat of what happened to Czechoslovakia. But of course, in diplomacy, as we all know, it only matters what the other side interprets it as. It doesn't matter what your intentions are if they're misread. And both sides misread this. Poland believes essentially it's unconditional support to prevent any negotiation of territory, and Germany interprets this as a hostile act to prevent the restoration of these territories. So, from a diplomatic perspective, you can say it was born out of intentions to, if anything, maintain the spirit of the Munich Agreement, not Neville Chamberlain and Halifax reacting emotionally, which has often been described as, but rather it was made with the best of intentions, but it turned out to be one of the most incompetent acts of diplomacy ever committed by a British government. Because what did Hitler do? He instantly renounced Germany's participation in a non aggression pact, which had been signed with Poland in 1934. And Germany then went on to annex Memel in Lithuania. So you can say the stage had been set for the Polish crisis that would occupy the next 6 months, and indeed act as the prelude to the Nazi-Soviet pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
I'm not sure if this was meant to make it sound like it in the book. Um, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was it secret? I thought it was secret.
No, the pact itself was public. There were
Okay.
secret addendums to the pact involving the specific allocation of territories. So, for example, within the pact, there was a secret understanding that Germany would occupy Poland, Russia would occupy, actually, Germany originally was supposed to occupy Lithuania. The Soviet Union would occupy eastern Poland, which would be annexed into Ukraine and Belarus. They would have influence over the Baltic states and influence over Finland. But of course, they couldn't exactly announce to the world that we are going to conquer these territories over the next year.
Yes, but this was this a sort of a tool that Hitler was just trying to use to force Poland and Britain into the giving up Danzig, because Hitler had set out to destroy Bolshevism and to then jump in bed basically with the Soviet Union seems more, and then to break that right pretty much a couple of years later seems to me just putting pressure on the Allies and Poland into acquiescing.
Yes, that's essentially correct, and that's the position I've always maintained, is that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was meant to prevent World War II, not start it. Essentially, it was a coup de grace. It was the greatest powers, land powers in Europe, have decided that this country will no longer exist, or if it does exist, it will be under basically a co-dominion. It'll be a power sharing agreement. Thereby, it would be ludicrous for a weakened France and a Britain which has not prepared for war and can barely maintain any divisions in Europe to get involved over an area which is basically none of their business. For Germany and for the Soviet Union, this was a matter of, utmost priority, the issue of Poland. For the Soviet Union, this was about the restoration of the old borders of Imperial Russia. For Germany, the repatriation of ethnic Germans, and you can say the culmination, ironically, of Wilsonian self-determination. But for Britain and France, this was virtually inexplicable. And we go back to that point you raised very early on, what the hard power realpolitik considerations for defending Belgium from Britain's perspective versus defending Poland, of which there were very few, especially if you've already lost your other allies, and Romania ultimately will not prove to be an ally, as the Poles will not activate that alliance. But yes, essentially you're correct. Joseph Beck, the foreign minister of Poland, basically stalwalled any attempted negotiations over Danzig and the corridor. And as you also mentioned, regarding the no, the Moscow Pact was not intended to initiate World War II. Did miss some fit as we're going into in some length. The assumption essentially was, in terms of Bolshevism being the final enemy, how are we going to achieve it? Well, as we've already mentioned, there's an aspect of spontaneity and luck involving how Germany's been able to gain this position in Europe thus far. Regarding Poland, there were many options available to Hitler. One would be a formal alliance with the conclusion of these various territories handed over to Germany. Because I believe even among the National Socialists, had Hitler agreed an alliance with Poland without any territorial concessions, I don't think that would have even been politically possible for Hitler to agree to that. So any alliance with Poland would, at a minimum, have involved the concession of Danzig, which again wasn't even technically part of Poland, and a way for the Germans to cross over the Polish corridor to link geographically East Prussia and the rest of Germany. That would have been the minimal aim. Indeed, that was the position that basically Hitler offered. The bigger offer, essentially, would be for Germany to restore its Kaiserreich era borders, which would have included Silesia, Poznan, parts of Prussia, and of course all of the Polish corridor. And the most extreme iteration of that would mean the annexation of all of Poland as some sort of prelude to attack the Soviet Union, which is ultimately what happened. It's very possible that had Poland acquiesced to an alliance, that it would have essentially been a alliance as a precursor towards vassalage and then subjugation and then wholesale sort of German colonization, which is very possible. But had Poland willingly gone over to Germany, Germany and Poland would have been in a much stronger position to fight the Soviet Union. They could have then involved all of the other Baltic countries. Also consider the fact that had Poland gone over to Germany, Romania would essentially have no choice but to join in with the Germans as well. And they also had, you can say, I wouldn't say a preferential regime, but Romania was facing its own domestic situation with the Iron Guard and a lot of hardcore sort of fascist and even National Socialist sympathizers who wanted to defeat Bolshevism and wanted to hold Greater Romania together. And also, there was actually a strategic impetus to contain Hungary, of all things. So Germany could play all of these Central European powers against each other by holding on to Poland. And if anything, holding on to Poland would then engender good relations towards other powers in the region, such as Sweden and such as Finland. Sweden, in particular, having a mineral advantage over Germany, which was necessary in terms of them fighting a protracted war. So, from Hitler's perspective, either we have the most aggressive approach, which is just conquer the Soviet Union, which is what happened in 1941, or we can try a grand diplomatic approach of attacking the Soviet Union by uniting all of the small nations in the East. What the guarantee effectively did is deny any possibility of that. And from Hitler's point of view, this represented some sort of antithesis ideologically. He believed the war should be with the Soviet Union, and instead, he was fighting a war with the nation he wanted most to ally with, which was the United Kingdom. And in terms of sort of, you can say, the fundamental weakness in terms of Hitler's understanding, is that Hitler did not appreciate the political or diplomatic situation in Britain, which was basically that of a decentralized form of rulership, many of whose elites were focused on a period of, you can say, they were fundamentally focused on internationalism, but an internationalism that would essentially permit a long suicide, which has been essentially the case of British foreign policy from the late 19th and throughout the entirety of the 20th century. He could not understand that there was not some sort of great Cecil Rhodes figure in Britain waiting to take power, who would have held the British Empire together through racial fiat and would have attempted basically to consolidate the British Empire and its racial position, Anglo-Saxons vis-a-vis the natives, which is what Hitler would have dreamed of, essentially. Britain controlling, you can say, the Anglo-Saxon races in the wider world and controlling the sea, whilst Germany is basically given carte blanche to establish its own equivalent of the manifest destiny, the American manifest destiny, by expanding at the expense of the Slavs in the East. So ideologically, as you can see, this is antithetical. Hitler allying with the Soviet Union ultimately to allow him to fight a one-front war against France and Britain. But that is the bizarre situation he found himself in. And indeed, as in contradiction to what Didymus says in the chat, when the Nazi-Soviet pact was concluded, Hitler believed that he finally found a mechanism of preventing war with Britain and France by divvying up Poland. Instead, what happened is that Halifax and Chamberlain recommitted themselves to the agreement, And as a consequence, Hitler actually delayed the invasion by 1 week to allow for negotiations to continue with the Poles. No negotiations occurred, and so Hitler invaded Poland, still not expecting that the guarantee would amount to a full-scale alliance. And not only did the Allies basically hoodwink Hitler, but they also hoodwinked Poland, because Joseph Beck and Ridsmigli, all the sort of the regime of colonels in Poland who had succeeded Pilsudski, believed that if Poland went to war against Germany, Poland would have a concurrent second front with France activating essentially their army on the Western Front, moving out of the Maginot Line and invading the Rhineland. Essentially, Poland had to suffer the full brunt of the German assault, and then the Soviets coming in from the rear, while France basically did nothing other than occupy a few villages that were undefended. So yeah, again, from every sort of strategic point of view, in terms of making enemies and alienating people, um, it's quite remarkable to see. And from my point of view, it's actually again something Pat Buchanan doesn't really get into, but I will get into this for him. Is that when the Soviets divvied up Poland, what Pat Buchanan talks about is sort of great moralities, is the phrase he keeps throwing around, great moralities as a defining sort of guide to foreign policy. What great morality underpinned a war with Germany when the Soviet Union began attacking and invading countries on the Eastern Front? And like I said earlier, Winston Churchill was A-OK with this because it basically pushed the Soviet border closer to Germany and prevented the creation of a buffer state. But if you're going to war for the defense of Poland, you're turning a blind eye to a power which has occupied the eastern half of Poland and will attack Finland. Indeed, the hypocrisy of the situation was so severe that had not Stalin pulled out of the Finnish fiasco in 1940, it's possible that Britain could have gone to war with the Soviet Union over Finland. But of course, Stalin rescued himself from that, and then all such questions were forestalled by the May 10th invasion and the fall of France. But it should be interesting to note that having presented Europe with the, you can say, the coup de grace, which was the Nazi-Soviet pact, which Hitler believed would prevent any declaration of war on him. After having conquered Poland, he offered up the possibility of negotiations in October of 1939. And of course, the British did not enter into negotiations with Germany, despite the fact that the Soviets were now involved. And from there, France is occupied. And even when France is occupied, Hitler offers that same opportunity again in July of 1940 to enter into negotiations with the British. Now, the British ultimately would have to offer far more concessions than they would have had to offer in 1939. But even then, Hitler's goals were essentially that of sating the German population at home. Hitler was in no position after the fall of France to basically say to Britain, we'll just ask nothing of you. We'll give you, no war indemnity, nothing. The political situation in Germany would have basically forced him to demand the restoration of Cameroon and of Namibia, German East Africa, which represent Tanzania, Kaiser Wilhelm Land, and all of these other colonies that were taken in the First World War. But other than that, you can say Hitler would have sought very modest goals. And indeed, with his Treaty of Compiègne with France, yes, Germany occupied the north and the west of France, but he annexed no territories from Vichy France in terms of the empire. The empire was maintained, and he didn't even seize the French Navy, which was allowed to maintain itself at Mers el-Kabir. Indeed, what power actually attacked the French Navy? It wasn't the Germans, it was the British.
Indeed, this is why I think even we don't even really need to get into sort of the most of the war, because this is why I think this is Stalin's victory. The fact that Hitler uh, went west, basically was in some sense forced to go west because of the ridiculous Poland, or guarantee of Poland. basically led to Stalin's ability to get the Western democracies into an alliance, basically, that would lead to East for all because of practical matters, leave Eastern Europe under his domination after this war.
I mean, Stalin's motivations were Stalin wanted perpetual conflict between neighboring powers. So he had deliberately prolonged the conflict between Japan and China in the east. So long as one power didn't maintain primacy over the other, Stalin was completely happy with this because he believed continuous land wars or two front wars would just make the Soviet Union stronger. So his goal with enabling the Nazi Soviet pact was not only the restoration of Russia's imperial territories, which would ultimately include Bukovina and Bessarabia, but he also wanted France and Germany to renew basically a World War One style trench warfare, which would last indefinitely and allow the Soviet Union to come in at a point of its choosing and conquer Germany from behind. Indeed, the longer the war went on in the West, Stalin believed, the more powerful that made him. Essentially, he had all the cards. And Churchill understood this. And because Churchill, after July of 1940, decided that he was not only going to prolong the conflict, but he was going to escalate it, he was going to essentially, and again, this is something else Pat Buchanan brings about, is that this all becomes a moral argument now. To what extent are you willing to fight this war to defeat Germany? And what should have been readily apparent to all politicians, including Churchill in 1940, is that it would have involved the destruction of the empire, trade the empire in terms of defeating Germany. And many historians basically believe that was justified. And what Pat Buchanan contends with this view is that this whole argument presupposes that Hitler was infinitely worse than Stalin. And not taking his argument in hindsight, but based on the plans of Germany and the Holocaust, which hadn't occurred yet, what he is basing this off is that by 1940, Germany had killed, in terms of its own sort of population, tens of thousands, whereas Stalin had killed millions. So objectively, and indeed, Hitler also couldn't understand as to why Bolshevism was more amenable to these people than National Socialism. So ideologically, and in terms of the brutality of the regime, you can say there was a logic from Hitler in terms of understanding that, and again, actually Hess believed this so defiantly, that he actually tried to fly over to Scotland to conclude a peace with the Allies on that basis of
Hmm.
stopping the war and going off to invade the greater power. So what is interesting considering all of this is that it's not only Britain, but it's Britain led by the quote unquote arch anti-communist, who is basically banking his entire strategy now on allowing the Soviet Union to enter the war and defeat Hitler with the acquiescence of the Americans in the West. So there had to come not only a strategic judgment, but a moral judgment in terms of being able to implicate this. And yes, there were many people in the American administration who were communists and who sympathized with the communists and were as antithetically anti-German, if not more so, than the British, Morgenthau perhaps being the primary example. So, but America wasn't at war with Germany at this point. This was Britain. America had far more of an incentive, you can say, to enter the war if it meant them receiving the influence of the British Empire than Britain did. So, of all the decisions, you can say this is the most inexplicable. And you can say this was also Churchill's most contentious moment of his career, deciding to fight on, deciding to prolong, deciding to escalate, and deciding to massively raise the stakes of this conflict and involve necessarily the creation of the most horrific front in the history of warfare, which was the Eastern Front in World War II.
And it sort of puts a different light on the speech that Churchill gives, that received big attention from a movie. What was that?
Oh, the finest. Oh, that was a. Don't remind me of that film.
Well, it's just quite interesting because it's it leaves so much out as well. Uh, that movie and emphasizes, something that in some sense, that is being claimed as the finest hour, but is also just the biggest blunder
Do you
of
want me to just, do you
all.
want me to just summarize that for the audience, just to give them a bit of a chuckle here?
Sure.
The film is basically Lord Halifax, who, having basically blundered his way into starting the war in 1939, is now wanting to seek the Italians as mediating a potential peace settlement with Germany, basically the opposite of Churchill's position. Churchill is basically presented as the anti-establishment man. He's hated by the Conservative Party. Chamberlain, who is still head of the Conservative Party, won't even allow his own MPs to support him, etc. Just ironically, you can say that the plot is actually quite Trumpian in the way that Winston Churchill is some sort of Trump character versus the Republicans. In fact, I know Trump watched this film and actually became a little bit obsessed with it. But why this film is so hilarious is that it puts the pro-peace Halifax as the clear enemy, and it makes Churchill the unambiguous goody, even though was it Gary Oldman's performance is basically that of a lumbering obese drunk, and ultimately what gives him the motivation to go off and fight down these politicians and continuing the "we shall never surrender" mantra. The idea is given to him by a black man on the London Underground.
Yeah, that is quite funny. I never really thought about that aspect of it, but also just like it is, of course, going to like this, very diverse, London underground scene to get his answers. He's basically incapable of making a decision for himself, and he needs
Well, no, I mean, he's already made the decision. It's about the
well,
courage. It's
okay,
about the courage and the inspiration. So, on the one hand, you have the black man, the inexplicable black man in the London Underground who wants him to do this as representing the will of the people. But then you have the scene with the king coming around and saying, "Yes, well, I believe you, and I want to stand by you with this." Just oh, blood, it just, I mean, it's the most sort of pathetic Hollywood of Hollywood movies. If you're going to trivialize such you can say the defining moment in terms of the ruination of the British Empire, then you've sort of reached this sort of pinnacle spectacle. And of course, how does that film end? At the beginning of the film, you have you have a Neville Chamberlain saying, "Oh, I'm not going to give my support," and then at the end, he does give his support. It's just a paint by numbers plot, and I don't know. It's just it offends me on so many levels.
Yes. Okay. Well, I think that's a interesting way to come to an end regarding this conversation. I mean, there's plenty more that we could talk about, and maybe there is a possibility of talking about it more. But I think this is a good place to stop, at least for now. AM, thank you for coming on the channel. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and you're always a well of knowledge and insight. Anything big upcoming on your channel that you'd like to promote?
No, not really. Just if people are, I don't know, interested in, I don't know, similar things, there are a couple of episodes on my channel. But other than that, I just want to say thank you, Connor, for letting me on and for suggesting today's topics. It gave me an opportunity to reread the book, and it was an enjoyable experience. So thank you for that.
I'm glad. Thank you all for watching. Um, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And have a blessed rest of your day. And bye.